So the winter of 1916 to 1917 is known as the turnip winter. Exceptionally cold weather and poor potato harvest led to a major fuel shortage and a food shortage and a fuel crisis. Okay, because there was no fuel for heating oil. During this winter, deaths from hypothermia and starvation, because there was not enough food to go around, went up to 293,000 individuals. By 1918, infant mortality as a result of cold, as a result of lack of nutrition, had risen to 50%. Okay, so half of all babies died in 1918 in Germany. So by 1917, total war had led to extreme discontent at home. There was a scarcity of clothing, of soap, of food. Agricultural production fell. Meat consumption was only about 12% of its pre-war level, for example. Basically, between 1916 and 1917, it's estimated that malnutrition and starvation accounted for about 750,000 dead. There are those who were very, very committed to the war effort and believed that, Germany would absolutely see through to the end, would be able to outlast the Allies. Beginning in 1916 and then accelerating in 1917, especially among the working class, you start to see more and more spontaneous strikes, work stoppages, refusals to continue to sort of serve as the labor force for an economy that is entirely geared towards armaments production, particularly in the face of so much suffering at home. An attempt to break the French lines in the west at Verdun led to casualties at what had been a totally unimaginable scale for a single battle. Okay, so between February and June of 1916, fully 350,000 French and 281,000 Germans were killed, and yet the French managed to hold on. Because the war had sort of taken precedent over all domestic matters, the Kaiser, that is Wilhelm II, found himself increasingly sidelined. He was not a military man. He wasn't somebody who fully understood the ins and outs of strategy. He didn't fully understand the ins and outs of political economy. And he was basically sidelined in political and military matters. This is what is referred to as the silent dictatorship, which is to say it's not an official dictatorship, but functionally the military has been given full command, full power, full dictatorship over the country. It's in this context that the somewhat unpopular chief of the general staff, a gentleman by the name of Falkenhayn, was dismissed in August 1916 and replaced by Hindenburg as chief of general staff and Erich Ludendorff as quartermaster general, his sort of second in command. Now, at the time, thanks to Hindenburg's sort of national hero status, they have enormous popular support across Germany, and they use this to strengthen political and economic control over Germany. In July of 1917, a peace resolution was passed by the German Reichstag, basically calling on the military leaders to pursue peace talks with their enemies. Those of you who remember the 7 Years' War should remember when all seemed lost, when it looked like Russia was about to conquer Germany, when it looked like Frederick the Great's valiant efforts were going to all be in vain, the Germans were saved miraculously when the monarch of Russia died. And their replacement immediately switched sides in the war. So saving Germany, basically, from defeat at the hands of Russia through what very much seemed like a miracle. Once again, in March of 1917, the Russian Revolution, which sweeps the Russian Tsar out of power and installs instead a communist government in Russia, takes place. The Russian communists, the Bolsheviks, basically, who by November of 1917 managed to finally secure power in Russia. They do so promising to end the war. Russians didn't want to be fighting the war any more than the Germans did at this point. Now, unfortunately for Germany, this, what seemed like a lucky turn of events, did not last long. So on the 6th of April of 1917, the United States declares war on Germany. This is partly in response to Germany's resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare and the sinking of American merchant vessels. With the entry of the United States into the war, victory is basically impossible for Germany. There is simply no way for Germany to hold out, given its limitations, if a serious contingent of American troops arrive in Europe. So the German General Staff decides to put all of its eggs in one last basket, one last hope. This is the Ludendorff Offensive. So having already all but lost the war on the Western Front as far as the generals were concerned, Ludendorff planned this last-ditch effort to push French troops back to the coast, which, if they could do that, then they might be able to prevent a large-scale landing of American troops. Unfortunately, the Ludendorff Offensive ended up stretching Germany's troops so thin that they couldn't hold up the supply lines that they needed to be able to continue to sort of push French troops backwards. Eventually, troops became slow, they were starving, and they started resorting to desperate measures like eating their own horses as they advanced west. Now, in hopes of salvaging what had been promised as Germany's last hope of victory, one of the commanders in the German Navy, Admiral Franz von Hipper, convinces the German Naval Command in Kiel, in the north of Germany, to basically dispatch his fleet on what was understood to be a suicide mission, in the hopes of engaging the Royal Navy in the English Channel. Not really for any strategic purpose, but on the grounds that it would be one last grand display of German heroism, right? That Germany would always go down fighting. Unfortunately for the German General Staff, the sailors didn't love this idea. They were not very keen to be sent on a suicide mission for no reason. This results in the soldiers basically organizing a revolt, a mutiny. Some of these sailors, were participants, had in socialist political circles. Many of them were threatened with execution for disobeying their orders. But the mutiny in Kiel ended up gaining popular support not only among the soldiers, but the working class and the middle classes in Kiel as well. And it was like a spark that lit a fire all across Germany. Spreads beginning early November of 1918 to much larger cities, coastal cities, Wilhelmshaven, Hamburg, Bremen, and then to Berlin, the capital. By the middle of November, a few days later, there was a revolution in Munich, in which the last Bavarian king, was deposed and a Bavarian Republic was proclaimed. Now, at this time, it also happens that the SPD, the Social Democratic Party in Germany, had taken control of the parliament, the German parliament, the Reichstag. A gentleman by the name of Friedrich Ebert was elected to the position of Imperial Chancellor in 1918, and Ebert took it upon himself to heed the sort of the public sentiment that was very obvious to everyone involved, and negotiate a peace treaty, because it was clear at this point, with the failure of the Ludendorff offensive, which was already a 1 in a million long shot, that Germany had lost this war. Fearing that this revolution, really, that is spreading all across Germany, this revolt against a military dictatorship, fearing that it's going to lead to some sort of chaos, to civil war even, and that it will result, frankly, in Germany's annexation by its enemies, the army and the general staff agree to support the new republic, the new regime, in return for assurances that the army would remain an independent act within German politics, and that the new government, the republic, would continue to suppress any inklings of a sort of a communist uprising. So now that Germany was basically prepared to unconditionally surrender, the military establishment had decided that there was absolutely no way forward for a German victory, and they told the civilian government to negotiate a peace treaty. Notably, they did this largely to shield themselves from responsibility. It was an agreement struck between the Social Democrats and the military leadership that any peace treaty would be negotiated entirely by the civilian government. And in exchange, the military would back the formation of a republic in Germany. This meant that forever afterwards, the German public associated the peace treaty that is concluded with the civilian government. And it allowed this idea that had the military been allowed to continue to prosecute the war, that things would have turned out differently. This is the origin of what comes to be known as the stabbed in the back myth. So the peace treaty that gets negotiated ends up being called the Treaty of Versailles. It's signed in Versailles on 28th of June 1919 in the Hall of Mirrors of the Palace of Versailles. Now you may remember, the Hall of Mirrors is the place where a unified German empire was proclaimed following Germany's defeat of France in 1871. This was not lost on any observer at the time. Certainly not on the French. Certainly not on the Germans. So the map of Europe was going to be redrawn according to the principle of national self-determination. The problem with the Treaty of Versailles from Germany's perspective, or the problems, I should say, were many and very large. So, among other things, the treaty forced Germans to accept a clause that basically puts the blame for the war entirely on Germany. So as a symbolic matter, that ends up being kind of a thumb in the eye of the German people. It also requires Germany to pay enormous war reparations. It has to pay off the debts of the other countries that had defeated it. And importantly, it has to do this not in its own currency, which it can print, but it has to do this in foreign currencies, francs and pound sterling, which are tied to the value of gold. This will cause problems later, we'll talk about. Finally, Germany is shrunk down and sort of neutered, right? So Germany is no longer allowed to maintain a standing army, or at least its standing army is to be curtailed substantially. It's not allowed to sort of start rearming itself. It loses the territories of Alsace and Lorraine. It loses a number of territories in the east. And the treaty is received very, very unhappily in Germany. So unhappily, in fact, that it really becomes the one thing that a very divided German public manages to agree on, is that the Treaty of Versailles cannot stand. This unifying rallying cry against the Treaty of Versailles ends up becoming the focal point of German politics, German society, German discourse for the decade that follows the conclusion of the First World War. And that we will talk about next time.